So good afternoon, good evening, everybody. You're welcome to today's Let's Talk Cybersecurity. That I want to talk about a day in the life of a cybersecurity professional. So today I have with me Tayo Okuboyejo, who is a cybersecurity risk SME, subject matter expert. That's what that means. So people have been asking me questions about what do you do in cybersecurity? And like I used to tell people, cybersecurity is very wide. You have many roles in it. And that is why we are doing this, starting with cybersecurity risk management. So she'll be taking us through what it entails in working in that area and what makes her a cybersecurity subject matter expert. Because if you go online, if you ask these questions, you see people talking about what do you do in cybersecurity. So we're giving you one today, and subsequent ones will be released as well. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand over the rein to Tayo. Even today, I'll be the one controlling our slides. So don't mind us. We want to do that so that we can give you the best in terms of the presentation. So Tayo, over to you. Make your introduction. And when you want me to share your slide, let me know and I'll go for it. Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. And thank you for joining this session. My name is Temitayo Okuboyejo. I am what you call a risk subject matter expert. I currently work for Accenture. So I do risk management mostly. I do sector risk, and I do operational technology risk, and I do business risk. So pretty much my entire working day is spent around looking at risk, identifying risks, mitigating risk, providing remediations, and all those nice stuff around risk. For those who I haven't met yet, or or those that are new to the community, I'll give a very, very, very brief background and how I got into this role. So in my previous life, and when I say previous life, I mean like 6-7 years ago, I worked as an engineer. So I trained, I have 2 engineering degrees. So, and I worked in the oil industry as an engineer. That's where me and my boss, that's where we met. And I did that for some time. Then I worked in government, and it was when I worked in government that I sort of got to work in corporate governance. So part of what I did in corporate governance included a little bit of assurance around information. And then, of course, because my Oga has always been speaking about this, and it was like, well, you should be able to do this, you can handle this. And I'm one of those really lazy people, or I like to think that I'm lazy. So I didn't want to do anything that would stress me too much, because I feel like I'm too old to learn new tricks. So I came on the training. I did the pre-fought cybersecurity training for 6 weeks. And then I found my first job. I did that for a few months. And then another job with, a government department before I then landed in my role in Accenture, where I then, shall I say, got the opportunity to now really develop into my role. So as we are probably all aware, risk is one part of the GRC, which is governance, risk, and compliance. Each on their own are quite big, and it's near impossible to be an expert at all 3. So more often than not, even though people would group this together, people tend to specialize in one area. So some people specialize in compliance, some people just in governance. I do mostly risk. So yeah, so that's kind of like a brief. So I said that, and I mentioned all these things. So people are, I know nothing about computers other than using it at home. I don't have a computer science background. I don't know how to write programs. I don't know any of those things. But here I am. So anyway, so on to the subject of the day. Mr. Jimo, can you please, upload or start the slide deck, please? Okay, so I'm going to apologize a little bit in advance There's a lot of slides, there's a lot of talking points, but I'm going to keep it very short and brief. I'm very happy to, share the slides later, and very also happy to field questions when we're done. Okay, so slide 1. So yeah, we are going to talk about a day in the life of a risk SME. So that's me. Right, so slide number 2, please. Right, so this slide is just like it's just a brief summary. I don't want to go into like definitions because I don't want this to feel like a classroom environment. I just want to talk about what this looks like in a work environment. So with respect to risk, how do organizations look at risk? They tend to look at risk as structural, something that goes from top to bottom. And from that, each layer in that top to bottom, the risk associated with each of them are identified, and the impacts of those risks manifesting on the business are then assessed, and the appropriate responses are then provided. So this is kind of like a brief one. So in the organization that I work for, sometimes with, where I am showing first line as business unit here, other times it's sector. We'll start from sector and then we'll come down to the actual business. And usually when they talk about that, they're talking about you'll hear them say the context of the business. It's basically to identify the specific risk associated with that business or associated with that sector. And then from then, you then move down, you go to the governance side of risk, where you kind of do like an overview. It's like, you're like on an aeroplane and you're looking down. That's what that governance side of things, like looking from top to down. How do you determine what your risk is? How do you provide guidance? Who are those people that will be responsible for it? And then below that, you then have like a process line. So in that process line, you then have where the objectives have now been broken down, and you have a way at auditing what you're doing. Like you say, this is what we're going to do. And then there is a process, or there is a line where the things that you said are going to do, you are doing it. So it's basically measuring yourself against your own metrics. So generally, for most organizations, this is kind of like the structure, even though they don't always say it. Third slide, please. Right. So what are risk governance objectives? Now, again, I said earlier on that risk is one part of GRC, governance, risk, and compliance. But here I am now, I'm saying, what is risk governance? Risk governance objectives. The idea is that to risk itself, someone has to be responsible for risk. Someone has to make the decision around risk. Someone has to determine or assess the impact of risk on a business. And this is where risk governance comes in. So risk governance is it's a way where the management of an organization decides what practices are within its business and what do they do to ensure that they account for those risks. And this is important because you cannot allow risk to kind of take you out of business. So the process of ensuring that you have safeguards in place, and those safeguards start from, keeping the value of your business, ensuring the value of your business is not eroded, ensuring that your processes are protected, determining what your assets are, who are the people that will be responsible for this, like who would be accountable. If your company gets into trouble and the press wants to speak to someone, who do they speak to? These are all the objectives that risk governance helps you to identify. So below that, below the green box, you can see the orange box, the 4 main objectives. I don't want to kind of like read all of that out. What I'm explaining here is saying, this is what in my everyday I would look at, like, okay, in our environments, or for this particular business, what are the common risks? What are the sectoral risks? How is the management looking and managing risk within its own business? Are the decisions that they are making, do they account for the risks that they have already identified? And once those risks have been identified, how are they managing those risks? What are the responses that they are providing? And after having provided those responses, what kind of controls do they have in measure? How do they audit those measures? Go to the next one. So now we move on to types of risk. So in this one, I'm kind of presenting like a generic view. I know we're all kind of used to talking about risk in terms of definitions. But for someone who deals specifically with risk, you are kind of looking at both a macro view and a micro view. So a macro view, for example, is where we're looking at, sector risk, for example. So the financial sector, there are specific risks that would only apply to the financial sector that wouldn't necessarily apply to, say, a retail business. The sector that I work in, for example, is considered critical national infrastructure. And for that sector specifically, there are some kind of risks that are specific to it. So those are sector risks. So you kind of have to look from top to bottom. So you start from sector risk, then you kind of go into, those sector risks, for example, are what people would classify as systemic risk. It's basically how the interrelationship of that business with other parts of the economy, how those risks would manifest on that business. So that's what a systemic risk is. Then you've got a contagious risk. So a contagious risk is a risk, as the definition says there, the kind of risk that if it affects someone in your line of business, potentially it could affect you too. So it's a bit like how people would say, someone in your classmates or someone in your workplace, for example, they've got a cough. If someone in a class has a cough, chances are plenty of other people in the class are going to get a cough. And I realize that's a very simplistic analogy or example. But the thing is, that's like the easiest way to explain what a contagious risk is. Like if a particular risk has manifested in a particular business, there is a very heavy possibility that that risk would happen to other. And I will give you an example. If we have all been following the news, you'll notice that a lot of government organizations are currently being attacked. They're getting data breaches. This year alone, in the past 2 to 3 months, on the news, we've heard the police, the NHS, the Ministry of Defense, and then most recently, Transport for London. All of these areas, all these organizations are all part of what you would call critical national infrastructure. So it means that at government level, so at a level that is above us, people like us, somebody needs to now start looking at these risks, because these are contagious risks that are now beginning to kind of attack government agencies and government organizations. So something is happening there. And I imagine that, like I said, at the government level, somebody is already looking at that. They're already seeing a pattern like this is beginning to look like a contagious risk. If the same thing were to happen, say, in the financial sector, if one bank gets hacked, chances are like 3-4 other banks are going to get hacked. And then once the ones who have not been hacked start to notice the pattern or the trend, they kind of start looking for ways to protect themselves. So going back to the example I was talking about earlier on about, one person in a classroom getting a cough, other people in the classroom potentially would maybe start, they'd go out and buy drugs to make sure that if they get it, they already have drugs, or maybe they stop attending classes altogether, or maybe they ensure that anybody that sits beside them is somebody that hasn't developed a cough and they walk around with an handkerchief. So these are like simplistic scenarios to use to describe it, but that's essentially what it is. And then, of course, you got the final one, which is an obscure risk. So this is a risk. We tend to call them black swan events because nobody has thought of them. It's not happened, but it doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. But it's kind of difficult to do an assessment that would present you with a scenario that would help you identify this particular type of risk. There is nothing that we can do about this. It's just, for example, it's like when COVID-19 happened, like the pandemic, that was an obscure risk that manifested. Nobody thought it would happen, but it just happened. And then obviously what we had to do as a country and as a world was to find a way to deal with it and ride out the storm until, we're all kind of back where we are today. Next slide, please. Right. So now coming to, the cybersecurity environment. So I'm going to now, come down and then, provide a little bit more detail around risk in the area that I work. So there are specific, I want to call them jargons, but some people don't like the use of that word. And some people find it disrespectful. So maybe we should just call them definitions of there. So there are some specific words that someone who operates in the risk environment must know, like what they mean. And I'm not going to read all of it out, but you can see it on here. So you've got to know what an asset is. You've got to know what vulnerability or weakness is. You need to know what a threat is. You need to be able to identify or estimate probabilities. You need to know what a threat agent is. You need to know what kind of exploits are possible. And these are all kind of ways in which you understand and in which you explain risk to someone either outside of the industry or even someone in the industry. But these are like standard, or shall I say, foundational definitions that you not only need to know them, you have to have like a thorough understanding of what they represent to the word risk. Next slide, please. So in addition to the ones that we have mentioned above, so there are other ones, and these are very rarely used. These are not the kind of risk you will hear people use in everyday language. So you would hear, the way you would hear vulnerability or exploit or threat actor, you will not hear these definitions, but they are definitions that a risk, I don't like calling myself an expert, but it's somebody who is very well grounded in the risk environment must know. So if I'm talking to someone and they say to me, so what's the risk appetite of this organization? Or if I'm talking to a client and I say to them, do you have any documentation on what their risk tolerance is, or what kind of threshold, or what kind of risk utility they've got in place? Those kind of things are something that those words, they're not words that we just throw around. They're like part of everyday language of working in the risk environment. Next one, please. So this looks rather boring, but it's a very, very, very important. In fact, if you don't take anything out of this conversation today, this is the one slide that you should take out. So this is what we call the risk management life cycle. It's basically cyclical. So it's like, although I've kind of presented it as bullet points, it really is a loop, like it's continuous. It never ends until you make a decision that this asset is no longer useful to me. I'm going to retire it. You need to kind of go through this. So if you start from identification, you do your assessment, you do your mitigation, you do your controls evaluation, you go right back to the beginning, as long as you remain in business. And bearing in mind, your assets are not necessarily your physical devices. They could be your information. It could be something that separates you from your competitors. It could even be just a formula. If a drugs manufacturing company, and the way you manufacture the composition of your paracetamol is different from the way other people manufacture their paracetamol, that formula, if that formula gets leaked and then other people, your competitors, get a hold of it and they start to manufacture paracetamol using the same formula that you are using, you have lost an asset. You've basically lost your competitive advantage. So when you think of assets in terms of anything that gives value, that provides value to an organization or to a business is an asset. So they don't necessarily have to be physical devices or tangible things that you can touch. They can also be intangible things. They can be software. They can be, they can even be people, for some organizations. If there are only 10 solutions architects in the world and their organization employs 3, Those three people are part of their assets, and they would probably find a way to risk assess for them, because they're the kind of value they represent to their company. And if they leave the company and go to other places, it potentially could mean they will lose business. So yeah, summarily, your assets are not just things that you can touch and feel. Sometimes they are not. Sometimes they're virtual things. Next slide, please. So with respect to the business environment specifically, risks tend to be, kind of broken down into tiers. And in my experience, they tend to be broken down this way. So you've got your strategic risk, which is at CEO level, like at board level. What kind of decisions, what kind of strategy are your senior management developing around risk? What kind of risk tolerance do they want to develop? How do they want to integrate risk management into the business chain? That sort of thing. That's what a strategic risk is. Then once that's been decided, you then have to find a way to kind of break it down into chunk size, where you then infuse or insert these broken down processes. And when I say broken down, I mean like cutting it into smaller parts. You then find a way to insert it into the smaller parts of the organization, so that it's not just management who is looking at risk. It is everybody, including the person at the gates, like the person that is letting cars into the car park. Everybody has a clear vision of what risk the organization intends to respond to and what the strategic risks are at their level. So in a sense, it's everything that an organization does from top to the bottom to ensure that they basically manage risk and manage it well. And that would include all kinds of risk. That would include supply chain risk. That would include, financial risk, reputational risk. What's that kind of risk, and legal risk, or every kind of, so a top to bottom, and specific sides would apply to specific people within the organizations. And all of that needs to be kind of understood in order to be, to work as a risk person. Next slide, please. So now moving on to our environment. Okay, sorry, Saeed, very quickly. I'm sorry, guys. How long do we have for this bit, so I know if I need to kind of speed things up or if I'm going at the right level? I'm about halfway through slides now.
No, it's okay. You're okay. Keep going.
All right. Okay. So we've been talking about all these things, and it will be interesting to, I think it will be nice for me to say, oh, I just learned all this stuff myself. I woke up one day and I suddenly developed all the knowledge around risk, but that's not really true. So there are frameworks, and frameworks, if you think of frameworks as skeletons, so those frameworks or those skeletons, everybody then kind of add flesh to those skeletons. So some people want to add flesh to make the skeleton look like a fat human. Some want to make it look like an obese human. Some want to make it look like a lean human. And that's essentially what a framework is. That skeleton that you now add flesh to is what your framework is. And what the framework does is basically to provide you with a structure. Like, this is what you follow if you want to conduct risk assessment, if you want to manage risk in your, it doesn't matter what kind of organization you are, what you are trying to do is to identify your risk and find a way to mitigate those or respond to those risks and provide safeguards. That's what frameworks do. So without kind of breaking this slide into far too much detail than that, it's basically your way. If you don't know anything about risk, you can pick up a framework, a risk management framework, and kind of follow it. And then we're going to talk about a few specific examples of frameworks. Next slide, please. So I'm very sure that all of us are familiar with the ISO 27001 framework. It's considered a risk-based framework, in essentially in that what it does is a bit of risk assessment in some way. And then what it does is that once those risks are identified, it then provides what we call safeguards and a method as to how you implement those things. So the ISO 27000 series is a long, body, or let me not say long. It's a body of frameworks that starts from risk identification to providing guidance on implementation, to what kind of controls you should have and how to implement those controls, and so on and so forth. So the very popular one that every organization would feel to a degree some level of comfort like around their risk will be ISO 27001 if they use that to implement safeguards to protect their assets, to a degree, provide some level of comfort. Next one, please. Next slide, please. So the other three frameworks, and to talk about are NIST 8. So these are special publication of NIST. So NIST is National. I can never ever remember the full meaning. National something, so National Information. I don't know. I'm sure Mr. Said knows. So NIST as an organization basically provide frameworks with respect to how to implement safeguards around all kinds of subject areas. So the special publications they've written for risk, there are 3 of them that are very specifically. So 30, 39, and 37, and you'll see what 37 does. So the number 37 is considered the risk management framework. Number 30, I believe, is for conducting risk assessments, and 39 is for managing risk within organizations with information systems. Both of them are important for someone who works in the risk environment to understand well and know when to refer to them when helping organizations to deal with risk. Next one, please. Next slide. Number 12. Now, so this one is the bread and butter of what we call risk management, in that it is called the risk management framework. And the reason why it's called the bread and butter of risk management is because of the way it kind of breaks down risk management into bite sizes that is very easy to not only learn, but also to understand and to present to clients. So you start with prepare, that's the one in the middle. And then from what they're doing at the preparing is you are gathering information from the organization, understanding the context, what kind of assets they've got in place, where they operate, who their competitors are. That's preparation. Then you go to categorize. So at categorized level, what you're doing in that level is that now you're looking at assets based on their criticality and sensitivity. So if you think about it, if an organization identifies, in fact, let me pick an organization. So let's say Transport for London, right? So if I were to walk into Transport for London today and I ask them, what are your assets? And we'll start listing all of their assets to me. Chances are that I will probably end up with like 5,000 assets. But then how do you risk manage 5,000 assets? If you try to do that, you want to cripple the business, because number one, it'll take forever. And number two, they probably don't have the resources to manage all those assets. So the necessary step would then be to do a categorization. And that categorization is based on the criticality and the sensitivity of those assets. So where the most critical and the most sensitive assets are grouped to the top. And then something called an impact assessment is then done on each of these assets. And from there, you then select the particular assets that needs to be protected. From there, you then move on to implement. So at the implement stage, what you're doing there is, after having identified those assets, you identify the risk, those risks that those assets that you've identified could face. And then you put in controls, you put in safeguards in place. So in order to put in those safeguards, the method which we use to put those safeguards in place is what we call the implementation stage. So this is where, so an example, so a new company or a company where all of their staff have always worked on site. So they have all their staff use laptops. They have no reason to, I don't know, have remote software on their assets. But then now suddenly they've decided that, oh, okay, for some reason, people are now going to work from home. Then it becomes important because now, whenever people are working, their laptops are not necessarily just, they will not be connected through their internal network anymore. It's everybody connecting from wherever, from their homes. So now that's a risk that we've identified. Like, look, if this laptop connects to a public network, chances are we could have something called like a middleman attack, or, you know, some person can hijack their session and steal the company's data. So then the company then decides that, oh, actually, so what we're going to do, so this is a risk that we've identified. So what we're going to do is to have VPNs installed on our laptops, because people are now going to work from home and there's a risk associated with that. And that's just one example. Some organization, in the spirit of preventing data losses, would make sure that they don't have flash drive, whatever, you know, like they don't have inputs for flash drives. So you cannot, you simply cannot put a flash disk and take information, or, so that they have a safeguard around. So those are the kind of, ways in which you would identify and then put safeguards in place. And that process of putting those safeguards in place is called implementation. Then the next one to that would be the assessment. So after you've put in your safeguards, you have to find a way. You have to have a way or a method where you assess the functionality and also the effectiveness of the controls that you have put in place. And this is where assessment comes in. And then finally, you've got authorized. So the authorized is, your senior management have already determined that this is going to happen. So the implementation, you've identified what you need to do. You've done the assessment. You found a way where you would assess the effectiveness. And then your bosses, the people who are paying all the money for this to happen, then says, right, all right, let's do it. And then once you've done that, you then have specific methodologies based on key risk indicators where you now monitor those risks. So the fact that you've put in safeguards in place does not mean that you are now fully protected from this risks. You have to find a way where you are now still monitoring your assets. If things start to behave out of sync, if you are now seeing things you are not expected to see, you need to be able to you need to have a method of identifying those things. And that's where monitoring comes in. And then again, like the risk management life cycle that I showed earlier on, this is a loop. It just keeps going. It never stops. Yeah. Next slide, please. So so with respect to conducting risk assessments themselves, so you've identified your assets, you've determined what you're going to do. What do you then do? So the entire risk assessment process is basically for you to be able to identify which risks are low and which ones are high. So one of the methods by which you would conduct risk assessment is this one called qualitative risk assessment. And basically what you're doing is you have a table. I'm sure many of us have seen tables like this where, you know, an assessment is done. The outcome of that assessment is presented from very low to very high. And you would see people spending a huge amount of time talking about risk that are high or very high and how to manage those risks. So next one, please. Oh, actually, sorry, before we move on from this, one other thing I should mention here is that the way I tend to kind of separate these two methods of conducting risk assessment is there is one that is based on numbers. There is one that is kind of subjective. So this one is the subjective one, qualitative. Now, so next slide, please. So, right. So the next type of, you know, the second type of a way of assessing risk is the quantitative risk assessment. So with this one is based on numbers. So basically someone would decide, or someone would do an estimate of the probability of these things happening. And they usually, what you have to remember with this thing is it's a little bit complicated as a process because it often involves other people who are doing calculations. But just remember that this is based on numbers. And more often than not, because of the amount of resources that are usually required, most organizations tend to favor the subjective one because it's very easy to do to a degree. Like you can get people who understand risk to a degree, sit down, do an assessment, and come up with a result that tells you, that tabulates the outcomes from very low to very high. And then you develop your mitigations based on that, as opposed to this one. Right, next slide, please. So with respect to quantitative analysis, there are specific terminologies that you need to understand. So these are around the asset value, the exposure factor, you know, annual rate of occurrence. They're very simple and easy calculations, to be honest. If you stick any of this into Google or whatever, you'll find them there. But this slide here is basically just to show that for quantitative analysis, these are specific terms. And, you know, if you're not, it doesn't matter if you're doing this kind of assessment. You still need to be able to understand these terms and what they mean and be able to use them in conversations when you're having conversations around risk. So if I am sitting in front of a client and they say, the annual rate of occurrence of this particular asset is 50%. And I ask them, so what's the value of the asset? And they say to me, oh, it's 10 million. I'm like, well, that means you have 5 million at risk. That's what it means. So essentially, it's kind of, you know, being able to have conversations around these terms, understand what they mean and where and how they apply. Next slide, please. We're almost there. So what's the difference between identifying risk and risk assessment? So people tend to use the terms interchangeably. This slide is just a simple way of saying, look, they are not interchangeable. So risk identification specifically has to do with assets. Like you basically have to identify assets. It's just remember, it's risk identification has to do with assets. But risk assessment has to do with process. So if you just kind of settle it in your head that way, it would help. But whatever you do, do not use risk identification and risk assessment interchangeably. One is to do with assets, the other one is to do with process. Next one, please. I think I talked about this. That was meant to be at the top. I talked about this already. So the two main methods of risk assessment, so qualitative and quantitative, and how some organizations would use a bit of both and have something called the hybrid method. I don't know many organizations that use a hybrid method because it can kind of get quite complicated. So most organizations will stick with one approach. And for the most part, the most popular approach that I've seen because of its ease of use and understanding is the qualitative approach. Next slide, please. Right. So we've talked about, identifying your risk assessment. So what do you then do? Remember that in that when I was talking about that risk management framework, and we talked about how, or I mentioned monitoring. So you've done all this work where you've identified where the risks are, what assets that needs to be protected. You've identified within your process how to provide safeguards. Then how do you ensure the effectiveness of the safeguards that you put in place? This is where control, monitoring, and reporting comes in. So essentially what you're doing is that you are looking at the safeguards and ensuring that they are still effective, that they have not weakened over time, or they are still applicable to your business as it stands today. Because if the business environment changes, so for example, the example I was using earlier on about, people working from home and people working in the office, the business environment has changed. And because the business environment has changed, it behoves the organization, their monitoring should identify that and tell them that, well, you need to have a safeguard in place for this particular thing. Like, people are going to work from home now, so have a safeguard in place. Your monitoring and the reporting process that you have in place is what will help you, identify that and push it up to the appropriate quarters to have it discussed, budgeted for, and funded. Yeah, next slide, please. So, various types of ways of monitoring. I really don't want to I think the next two slides are around how you do it. Many organizations choose to have risk registers. Others have a combination of risk registers and have a risk owner associated with specific processes. Some have like a risk manager be a member of their board whose job it is to kind of look at risk from top to bottom. Those type of things. This is where you kind of develop what kind of monitoring controls that you want to put in place. But you just want to make sure that you have provided enough of shall I call it, opportunity to ensure that the controls or the safeguards that you have in place are being looked at and they still meet the conditions that you set in your metrics. Your metrics being what you're looking at to say these things are still doing what we want them to do. It's essentially like having a door to your house. Maybe you don't check if your door is working every day, but if you suddenly open your door and one of the hinges looks like it's shaking, you know that there's a problem. So you know that to go and fix it. So the way you do that is visual inspection. From your eyes would look at it and be like, oh, this doesn't appear right. Because you know that doesn't appear, it needs to be fixed. So it's a little bit like that. Next slide, please. We're almost done. I think I talked about this a little bit. I don't really want to go into, too much of details of the process, but this is around risk owners, who you talk to, and how you kind of ensure that your monitoring controls are doing what they're supposed to do. Next slide, please. Right. So when you do, so one thing that organizations will do sometimes is that they would have either an internal audit or have external audits come in. And what those people would do would be to look at those controls that they have in place. So sometimes people would call this maturation exercises, so security maturation exercises. And what you're doing there is that you're looking at all these controls and you are reviewing them against a score. There are different types of scoring methods that are used. But what you're doing is telling this organization, so the most popular scoring system is something called the CMMI. I don't think I put it in here. Apologies. So it's called the CMMI scoring. It scores from 0 to 5. Almost everyone who does security maturation assessments know what this means. If an organization gets 0, it means that they don't care about the risk in the organizations at all. And anything that happens to them, they should just deal with it. Very, very rarely do organizations get beyond 3. And the reason for that is because it takes a significant amount of money or a significant amount of resources, dedication, and time to get an organization to be at 3. So to be at 3, it means all the organization's processes, significant processes, or their assets have been identified. They've got safeguards in place. They have a way of assessing those safeguards. They have reporting methods that are discussed in their security meetings that becomes a report that goes to maybe their board. Not many organizations can do that. So you tend to find that for many, many, many of the organizations that I've seen, I would tell you that around 70, maybe 75% of them, I will answer that question. Can you just keep that question in your pocket? I'll come to it in a minute. So sorry, I lost my train of thought there. Yeah, so the vast majority of organizations that I've worked with, between 75 to 80%, score 2, 2.5. In fact, I worked with an organization that someone else had done the maturation for them before I joined the company, and they were at 0.8. That was their average. So this was really bad. And this organization decided to focus on securing their cyber environment. And they spent around 2.5 million pounds over 18 months. And this included hiring about 4 people in addition to their entire IT staff. And another assessment that was done after, and this took them 18 months. So after 18 months and after having spent 2.5 million and hiring 4 people, when the maturation was done again, their security maturation. So I did this. I was the one that now did it after they put it on this. Their score was still less than 3. So I guess this is where I kind of put it into, or I help people understand that we're like in a completely different world now as regards cybersecurity, and it's going to be a long, long time before the businesses that sustain our lives feel safe because of the dangers that are out there. So in a sense, fortune favors the brave. Anyone who's brave enough to just dive into this industry and willing to put in the work, they will find a job. There's still so much work to be done. Even I am inundated by the amount of work that needs to be done. And this is like on the scale of, the kind of maturation that I have to do when I talk to organization, and how very little is understood around control assessments. Next slide, please. So this slide is basically like a brief breakdown of key risk indicators. They're very, very important to control reports, in that these indicators are the things that you put in place. Like it's like a set of metrics that as an organization you develop. And once you are not meeting those metrics, it is those indicators that will alert you that, well, you set yourself this metric, you're not meeting them. So you need to work on how to meet them. And these indicators differ from company to company. It takes a while to, come to a full understanding of how to do them. But essentially, they're an important part. Developing risk indicators are very important. And Saeed, sorry, go to the next slide. I was already talking about the next slide. Yeah, so they're very, very important, and they're very, very instrumental to the success of an organization to mitigate risk. Next slide, I think, is a continuation of this last one. So, yeah, so here we're basically looking at examples of key risk indicators. And like I said, this would differ from company to company. So as a risk, either as a risk owner or as a risk manager, you need to have the ability to be able to help organizations come up with what their risk indicators should be. So once you've understood their business, you've understand their process, you know what the business context is, you know what their assets are, then you kind of sit down together and you're like, well, these are some of the kind of indicators that would tell you that you are not measuring up to your risk management. So I think, yeah. And then in conclusion, so I think that's my final slide. So in conclusion, the risk environment is an interesting one. What you have to remember, someone told me this a long time ago, and I'm a Yoruba woman, so I've put this particular learning in my left hand and I don't eat with it, so I won't forget. So the person said, what you have to remember as a risk owner or as a risk person is that your job is to align the risk, the objectives of managing risk with the strategy, with the business, with the strategic position of the business. So you must, number one, so you must have strategic alignment. And number two, you must ensure that any kind of risk management or risk assessment or risk, whatever you do, you must ensure that it delivers value. So you need to be able to say, if we don't have safeguards for this risk and that risk and that risk, X amount of money is at stake. We could lose this much. And so that's like providing value. And then number three, it is to actually manage that thing we call managing risk. It is to also manage risk, actively managing risk and ensuring, once again, ensuring that you have a good way to monitor and report the outcome of any monitoring process you have in place to the people who make decisions in your business. And I think that's me. I think I about covered that in an hour. So there we are. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the job well done. And I believe you have a couple of questions coming from people. I don't think we need to do any recap because you've done a very good job to the topic of today and what we believe you have achieved for what we discussed earlier in preparation for this session. People would like to know what are the characteristics that some people would need to know or to have before they can function in such a position that you are, that is working as cybersecurity risk SME, which I know you have covered. And if it's not too clear, maybe people should ask in the comment section. And then, while you've described yourself for us, which I know everybody, unless you're late. Then finally, so people would like to know how you got into this role. What was the confidence you brought into it before you could, because you mentioned it there, and people say that a lot to me. You know, I once heard that statement you made. They said, fortune favors the brave. People will say, no, I've never done it before. No, I don't think I can do it. You started with telling us you're an engineer and how we met, became friends until date. The rest is history for today now. So tell us.
So let me start with this. I have a short attention span. You've asked.
Okay.
So let's do this question one by one. I'm sorry.
No. Just take the last one. I think the last one will help you.
Okay, so the last one. So yes. The last one is how I
got into this role.
Okay. So the way I came into this role is the way I've kind of come into any role, to be honest. I mean, I'm not a graduate. So before I joined the cybersecurity space, I worked in, like I said, I worked in the oil industry, which is like a challenging environment. And I worked in government, which is another challenging environment. So frankly speaking, I usually go to all my interviews and try to identify what I can call my best qualities. So they may not necessarily have to do with cybersecurity, but I always put that in front because I would always tell them, look, I have this diverse experience. Like I'm an engineer and then I worked in government. I worked very closely with a minister. I always say that. And while that may not necessarily be true for everyone, I think the first set of things that you should do is identify the best things that you have done, like your most significant achievements. Always put it in front. 9 times out of 10, organizations would identify with that. So even if you don't have, if they kind of look at you, I'm like, maybe you don't have the right kind of experience. In their mind, they're like, look, you're somebody who is used to getting results, and they'll be more than happy. And I know that may seem like a silly or going around the houses, but that usually is my first thing to do at interviews. Now, secondly, what I have done, I think to a degree, done very well, is that I understood from the go which area of cybersecurity I wanted to go to. So I didn't jump around. I mean, people who were in my class when we were having the training, I was the person that always said, look, I'm sorry, I don't have time to go and learn programming, all this technical. I'm not interested. I don't want to do that. So I understand, I identified very early where I wanted to go. And I just spent all my energy looking for information on that area. So for example, this risk thing, it would be crazy, but what if I told you that I actually sat down and read that risk management framework? I have actually read it back to back. It's like the most boring document ever, but I have read it. Risk, the CSF, the risk assessment part of NIST is not NIST 2.0, but NIST CSF. In fact, that one I didn't even read everything. I just read the bit that had to do with identify. Because once I understood that, identify your asset, I said, all right, okay, fine. Okay, this is what I need to do. So identify, I just read everything to do with identify. I read that a few times. And then it got to a point where whenever I go to an interview and they bring some foolish people who want to just show you up and talk about it. So once they start talking about technical stuff, I just stick to these things that I know. I just stick to the parts that I've read. And then they are forced to then ask me questions around those. Can I be like, look, and I always tell them, look, I'm sorry, I'm not a computer science grad. I don't have these are my skill sets. This is what I do. This is what I do. This is what I know. This is what I understand. So frankly speaking, the short answer is you just have to go out there and do it. But then you also have to know what you want to do, like which area interests you, and identify the knowledge that you need for those areas. So even if it's like a basic level, have a basic understanding for that area so that whenever you go to an interview and they're talking, you can follow a conversation, can have a conversation. Like, I was talking earlier on about risk definitions. Those are terms that you cannot, I would go to an interview and talk about, their inherent risk was this. At the time I didn't know. It's okay. The inherent risk, but then by the time we were done, the residual risk was spawned. But even though they still find it intolerable, it's a whole bunch of, I'm sorry, bullshitting, but that's what I'm doing. Because now I have read that this is the language of the industry. So I hopefully, I've been able to answer that question. So what did I say? 3 things. Number 1, you need to know what you want to do. You need to know the area you want to go into. Number 2, the area that you want to go into that you've already identified, you need to find a way to develop yourself, like a basic understanding or a basic foundational knowledge of that area. Number 2. And then number 3, highlight your achievements. Whenever you go for interviews, highlight the things that you have done in the past. Look, you're not like a piece of cardboard. You've done something somewhere and achieved results. Put it in front and find a way to loop it into that conversation. That's it. That's all I do. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much. You've answered the question correctly. There was a question waiting for you from Kosim. Then why do we have discuss up to 5 if an organization getting 3 takes this much work, which you promised to come back to? Remember that question?
So read that question again. Is it in the chat?
Yes, in the chat. When we are talking about CMMI, you're talking about the scale from 0 to 5, and you described what efforts and amount they spent, and they got 3 in the end, right? So
yes.
That's what the person is referring to.
So that question, I think, has disappeared from the chats. So you may have.
It is there. You have to scroll up.
I just scrolled up and I can only see up to. Oh, hang on.
I can repost it. I'll repaste it for you now to see.
Yeah, so please do that.
Yes.
Is it done?
Yes, I've done that. Yes.
All right. So, didn't you say you just reposted it? Something's wrong with my listing. No.
Okay, I'll read it again. The person said, then why do we have this course up to 5? That is CMMI up to 5. If an organization getting 3 takes this much work, that is, they spent a lot of money, like you explained to us and all that. Why did they still get 3? Why do we have it up to 5? Even if the best organization spending and giving attention are scoring 3. So why do we have to get it up to 5?
Okay. So number 1, you have to remember that the cybersecurity as we know it to a degree is something that came into global focus relatively recently. We're talking less than 10 years. I mean, people I know who have degrees in, like, universities didn't even start having cybersecurity programs until maybe 6-7 years ago. So a lot of organizations are starting at point 0. So this organization that I mentioned, for example, remember how I said their first score was like 0.8? So they are starting from like ground 0 to get to 2.5. And because what a lot of organizations are doing at the moment is starting from ground 0, everybody is going to get to maybe that average of 2.53 over the next, next 10 years. And then it will now become, that 2.5 will now maybe become something that everybody has. And then people will now start to build upon that. You will find that if you go to some of the most mature organizations are usually banks, right? And the reason why banks tend to be more, in fact, European banks, the reason why they tend to be more mature than other organizations is, as you know, what they deal with and how much they have to stay ahead of frauds, of all these kind of attempts that hackers would use to steal their money. So, for example, it's an interesting thing. I read, I'm sure all of us here know, what's his name? What's the name of this guy that used to flaunt on Instagram? Oh God, that guy that used to wear Gucci and was a fraud, is now in prison. Hush Puppy. So, Hush Puppy's case file that the FBI presented, it went around a bit. It's an interesting paper to read for a cybersecurity person. Do you know that these guys don't do anything sophisticated? They were doing BEX, business email compromise. And it's just phishing. They're not doing anything. They just write an email and put a link in the email. They disguise the email headers. So you think it's somebody within your organization. You don't realize that it's an external email. They switch out letters a little bit. My company, Accenture, they might switch the U and the R. And I wouldn't notice. And I just click the link they put in that email. And once they've done that. They've gotten access into your environment and they can do whatever they want. So what they were doing, they would just, once they get access into the environment, they would then tell someone, approve this money, pay this money into this account, and that was it. They were not doing anything particularly sophisticated. And the reason why I raise this is because now organizations have now become quite, they've now identified, they all know, everybody knows what a BEC is. In fact, my company, if an email does not come from within the Accenture network, it is immediately flagged as external. So that's with a banner, like this yellow hanging banner on top of it. So before, people didn't know that. Now people do it. So like everybody knows that, oh, okay, this is the way to avoid BECs. But now that we know that, your threat actors are developing new ways, right? So, of course, it may look like, oh, 5 is something that we could never achieve. But the point is, if you can get to 5, that's where your risk, when we assess your risk, we can then say, well, you have very low to low risk. So the chances of occurrence would be rare. But we're not saying that it can never happen. It's just that it will be rare. But whereas if you're in the middle, we're saying, well, 50-50, it might and it might not. So this is why you have to keep at it and continue to ensure that you have you maintain a good cyber posture within your organization. So hopefully that answers the question. I'm very happy to take a follow-up if the person is not satisfied with that answer.
I think you have answered the question correctly. The only bit I just wanted to add to that is, you might look to the person we are speaking in abstractive terms. This kid that we're talking about, they have names for them. And when you hear the names for each of the stages, then you know that they meant something. When they say 0 is absent, 1 is ad hoc, something like that.
Yes.
And then you get to a stage you talk about is defined. You define something, right? You can say this is how you want to do things. Then do you manage it? Is another level. Then you now talk about optimization, where you put technology into it that is giving you KPIs, like Tayo mentioned earlier on when she was in her presentation. So it's really a robust process. What I can give as an example for everybody to understand what Tayo is telling us today, which looks like a training to me if everybody takes this on board. It's like when Ofsted come to schools, they rate them, they give them different grades. And each of these grades, you might say, why did they give my school good? You need to understand how they arrived at that good. And that's the same way CMMI was designed. So every level, there are things that you need to have in place. And if you don't meet them, even if you put 10 million into your organization, if you have not done the right thing, you're not going to meet the expectation. And that's the way it works. Another question somebody was asking, I don't know if Tayo would be pleased to answer the question, but somebody's asking whether we have whether we have contract roles in risk management and what is the average rate. I don't know if you please.
I can. I'm very happy to answer that. So yes. So it depends on what area of risk. So for example, I've taken work as a supply chain risk manager before. I was like contract role for 3 months and my day rate was $550 a day. I have also interviewed for a government role. This was just information risk manager for a government department. And they paid £800 a day. So yeah, plenty of contract roles out there. And day rates, depending on which area of risk you're looking at, would have, it's kind of like a band between maybe 450 to 1,000, depending on which aspect of risk you're looking at.
Yes, just to add to what I mentioned there, people, when they hear the money, they will rush at it, right? There is regulation in the UK called IR35.
Uh-huh.
So you need to be aware of that. Before IR35, you take everything home. But IR35 now, they have to apply different kind of taxes to it. So at the end of the day, it's not a 500 that you take home. So if you are salivating already, I need to let you know that. So exactly, we need to tell them the reality. Somebody is asking here whether somebody who has been in media for years and what area to go into cybersecurity and if certification, bunch of questions here, like 3 in 1. Asking is in the media experience, with certifications, and how to get into the industry. So 3 in 1.
Okay. So media, right? Let me think. I think number one, this person would have to identify their interest specifically. But if you say media, let me think. I think I feel like somebody who is in media will understand the importance of libel, maybe intellectual property, that sort of thing. And in that respect, that person should be looking at either security governance or consider going into data protection specifically. Now, to go into data protection, it may require just a little bit of technical knowledge, but that would be so if the person is happy to put some time in to learn a few technical stuff, yes, they can do that. So hopefully that answers that. But these are just my opinion. You can pick any aspect of cybersecurity and run with it. Like I said, I identified an area that I want, and I just pretty much sweated and swatted over it until I kind of got to a point where I felt like I'm happy this is the path that I chose. The second question was certifications. So I graduated my diet. So I went to Mr. Said School of Cybersecurity in May 2022, I think. Yeah, May 2022. I started in May 2022. I graduated in June 2022. I had 0 certifications. In fact, I just got my first certification like 3 months ago. ISO 27001 lead auditor. Although I'm preparing for another set of, I'm going to write another exam by the end of this month, but I didn't need a certification. I didn't have a certification. I've worked for like 3 different companies, and the certification was not a requirement. As long as I was able to show that the job I was applying for, I had the requisite skills to be able to deliver on the job. So even this my current role with Accenture, I didn't have any certification before I got it. So that certification I got with the company. So in my experience, no. So certification is not like a solid requirement. It's not something that you have to have to get a job, in my experience. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, Tayo, for doing justice to those questions. I want to put a word of caution out there. When we were working in IT back in Nigeria then, our senior, the people that we look at as mentors then, they show a lot of certifications. It was like badges of honor for them. They could have like 10, like 15. So it makes it made it treacherous for us to say we want to aspire to their position. And that's what I tell people. It's not all about certification. It's about your knowledge. What you can tell them when you get to interview. That's what they're looking for. What they are looking for people that they don't have to spoon feed. They don't have to babysit you. They tell you what you need to do, you know what to do. But if you are the fearful type, cybersecurity is not for you, because people will give you tasks to do and they will leave you with it. Go and figure it out. So there are people that you're even working with your manager that do not have your own certification. Tayo, I think you can bear with me as to what I'm saying. They don't have your own certification that you labeled that you want to have. I have a guy who, like, he was a truck operator. He's working with me in my organization now. And he came through apprenticeship because he just got tired. And he said he was looking for IT. That's the one he got. So they took him to the IT line. When he realized the cybersecurity one, he just applied for cybersecurity. And he's a junior employee with us now. You can see the way he went. He wants to go apprenticeship, IT, because he feels he doesn't have the knowledge. But somebody just told him about this opportunity, and he just applied. And he was able to defend himself. And that's it. He got the job. So there are people where I have seen another crane operator, the same thing. So people will ask you questions like, do I need to have CISSP? Some of my managers don't have CISSP, even though I have it. You can imagine. And this is the gold passport of the industry. So people will get job first before they now pursue a particular certification. And that's what Tayo is telling you there. And when people come to me for training, they would start asking you some questions, and you're trying to manage it and help them. But that notion of, I need to know Python, I need to know this, is still ingrained or in their brain that they are struggling to just spit it out. And you're telling them what works, but they still come with that idea of, I need to have those big, big names. And you get to the interview, they ask you questions, you cannot answer the questions. So it happens like that. Chiamaka, read our message in the comment box there. Read Chiamaka's message. I don't want to talk about Chiamaka today. She's going to come to do a presentation another day, but she'll tell you how she got into the industry too. So I have Dr. Toksi. I didn't know he's going to join us today. Your question, sir, your hand is up.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I want to say initially a big thank you to the guest speaker of today. She nearly smashed everything that I was doing down in Thomas. Yes, I listened to her very well. Something I was not expecting, that I was doubting. I've learned a lot from her speech, and I want to say thank you for this damage you've done. I don't mean a bad damage; it's a good damage you've done. And for Mr. Said as well, I want to add into coming from academic environment and in the health sector environment twined. If during our own time in Nigeria, if you don't have all those certifications, you're not going to smell that seat. You're not going to smell that seat. Pythagoras, you got to do this, you got to do Phantom, you got to do all this, you got to do CCA plus, you got to do all that. If you don't do that, you cannot knock the door. But coming to Europe, what is apprenticeship in Nigeria? I remember back home when you fail in Nigeria, WAEC or JAM, 2, 3, 4 times JAM, you don't pass. The one of fear baba bricklayer, and one call of baba mechanic. But here, apprenticeship just started about 20 years ago through Alan Sugar. You now see most of our children, they will tell you, Mom, Dad, I am not going to university, it's not for me. My route is to go to apprenticeship. And I can say to you, 80% of people on this platform will not agree with their children going apprenticeship. An apprenticeship is the route of Gateway with all the certificates, with badges you both have, both Mr. Said and Amaka or whatever. If you go for any interview today, the person that will interview you hasn't got enough certificate you've got. It might just be somebody who's been in that industry for 20, 30 years. You'll find out somebody who's your manager, you just have GCSE or WAEC, but a lot of experiences. So please, if you ask me now, what is cybersecurity? I've known it now. Before I was like, that's my knowledge. That on my blog, I want to yahoo. To be honest, that is it. Until when the Boko Haram and NIMS started, that's when I started getting into cyber cafe and started doing. Even if you go to NHS now, I work in NHS. If you go to our IT section, One day when Mr. Said brought somebody to speak to us a couple of months ago, and I went to my IT person. He's a manager. He's a band 8B. And I said, oh, I went for this lecture, Cyber Cafe Security. He said, what is that? He said, no, don't need it. They're wasting time. That day, I knew he doesn't know anything about it. But he's training people. And as a guy of my own son's age, who came in and said, no, this is what we do. And the guy was just going, he's about 19-year-old child. He was smooth on Cyber Cafe. He educated me for 2 hours. But the guy who is his manager, 8B, doesn't have a clue. So please, my dear sister, my dear brother, keep on moving. Let's educate our children. Our children are there rotting. They don't have an idea of this. It's not only Yahoo, 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 Yahoo. Like I believe before, I don't say Yahoo, Yahoo, and don't say Cyber Cafe, block. In 90s, if you don't have certificate, you can't move in. Even mid-20s. But now, people are now waking up. With the lectures you pass on today, my sister, God will enrich you more. In a Muslim way, they will say, God will give you more wisdom. So, they will say, Sanukurika Falatansa. Alaji Said will tell you the meaning. I'm not an Afar, but I thank you. I appreciate you. That's just what I need to ship in. Thank you so much. Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Ogunfemi. That's how passionate he is, giving back to the community, and he talks about this everywhere he goes to. I mean, it's just a pity when you talk to people, they don't catch the fire, they don't understand. They put the money before the opportunity, the value they are going to get. I mean, this is not going to go into recording now, but we're going to cut it off. But let's just say this. Back in the days, before now, because a lot of people here, they are from the UK, some are in Nigeria, some are even thinking of Jackma, they want to come into the UK later on. So let's tell us the truth. Before, our progenitors, people that came here before, they don't talk about all these professional related opportunities. What they'll tell you, you do care job, you do security, you do da. And that has limited our exposure in the community because we are not part of the decision makers. So if you are new into this country and you are listening to us today, it's an opportunity for you to choose a professional line. If you don't choose it, tomorrow you'll be the one to blame yourself for that. So it's just, they say short words are enough for the wise. So I thank you all for your presence today, for listening. In fact, you didn't give us any problem. I didn't have to mute people hearing noises here and there. So thank you very much. I must appreciate you for that. And Chiamaka, thank you for answering that question. You have years of experience from the jobs you have done in past years. All those experience forms a foundation to your knowledge. That's for the person asking question before. And somebody says so didactic and well explained. Thank you very much. It means it makes sense to every one of us. So on this note, we thank you very much for joining us, and then we appreciate you. We hope to see you next time again, and then we'll take it from there. We'll bring somebody else to come and talk to you in another role. If we have not answered your question, we'll take that next time, or you can message me or Tayo, and we'll be able to take that. But before we close the curtain, just wanted to show you that is our calendar for 2025 for training for those of you thinking of doing cybersecurity. That is the calendar. The number is there. Get in touch and we can take it further. That is what I want to say. And without any further ado, I want to say thank you again. And we're going to end this session there. Copy the number, the details if you want, get in touch and we can take it further. Thank you very much for listening. Tayo, anything from you?
No, thank you everyone for your attention and your time and the questions. It's always nice to be able to share one's experience. And I'm happy for anyone to reach out to ask me any more questions if they want as well. So thank you very much and God bless.
Yeah.